What would you do if the people who humiliated you, drenched you in champagne, and laughed as you begged for mercy, suddenly found out you were the sister of the man who owns everything they love? That's exactly what happened to Emma Carter, a woman they thought was nothing, a woman they tried to crush. But tonight the tables are turning, and the elite are about to learn what true power really looks like. Stay tuned, because their nightmare is just beginning. The cruise ship towered above the pier, like a gleaming palace on water, its decks shimmering beneath the afternoon sun, a floating fortress of opulence and power. Emma Carter stepped onto the gangway, her simple sundress fluttering around her legs, her scuffed flat scraping against the pristine white floors. Around her, women draped in silks and jewels glided past, their diamond earrings flashing like knives, their perfumes choking the air with sweet, suffocating clouds. Men in tailored suits strutted by, their watches gleaming, their eyes flicking over Emma as if she were a speck of dirt marring their perfect world. Emma swallowed her throat tight, her palms damp as she clutched the thin strap of her worn handbag. Her gaze darted around, searching for a place to hide, a corner to disappear into, but there was no escaping the scrutinizing eyes, the judgmental stares, the whispers that hissed through the air like venom. Oh my God! A woman in a crimson gown drawled, her manicured nails wrapped around a champagne flute as her eyes raked over Emma's dress with a sneer. Did they let the help on board for drinks now? Laughter erupted around her, the sound sharp and cruel, slicing through Emma's chest. Emma's cheeks flushed, her heart pounding, but she kept her head down, her jaw clenched, her nails digging into her palm. Maybe she's here to clean the bathrooms, the woman's friend quipped, her red lips curving into a wicked smirk as she sipped her champagne, her eyes glinting with malicious glee. Emma stepped forward, her knees shaking, her breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts as she wove through the crowd, eyes locked on the floor, on the polished marble tiles that gleamed beneath her feet. But the whispers followed her, a tide of sneers and snickers that crashed against her like relentless waves. Seriously? Who let her in? I didn't know they were giving out charity tickets. She looks like she crawled out of a thrift store. Emma's jaw tightened. Her fists clenched, her nails biting into her palms as the laughter echoed in her ears, louder, sharper each cruel cackle, a knife driving deeper into her heart. The grand ballroom loomed ahead, its gilded doors flung open, spilling golden light and lilting music into the corridor. Emma's heart pounded, her pulse roaring like a tidal wave as she stepped inside, her eyes darting over the crowd, searching for a place to hide. But there was no place to hide, not here, not among them. The room was a sea of glittering gowns and diamond-studded necks, of silk ties and cufflinks that caught the light like shards of glass. Waiters in white gloves glided through the throng, silver trays balanced on their palms, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres to guests who didn't even glance their way. Emma edged toward the far wall, her back pressed against the cool marble, her breaths coming in short, trembling gasps as she tried to make herself small, invisible. But the whispers found her winding through the crowd, like a serpent wrapping around her throat, squeezing tighter and tighter. "Look at her shoes," a woman snickered, her voice a venomous purr. "Those are 5 years old, maybe 10. Her friend sneered, her eyes raking over Emma's flats with a look of disgust. God, does she even own a brush? Emma's vision blurred, her chest tightening, her pulse thundering as she swallowed the lump lodged in her throat. The music swelled, the violins rising in a haunting crescendo, a soundtrack to her silent humiliation. And then, as if on cue, a man stepped forward, his hand wrapped around the stem of a champagne flute, his tailored suit fitting his muscular frame like a second skin. His eyes locked onto Emma, his lips curving into a slow, cruel smile. "Lost sweetheart," he drawled, his voice dripping with false sweetness as he took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Emma's heart stuttered, her spine pressing against the wall, her breath catching in her throat. The man's gaze swept over her, from her tousled hair to her trembling hands to her threadbare dress, his smirk widening, his eyes gleaming. "You must be the entertainment," he said, leaning closer, his breath hot against her ear. "Because there's no way someone like you belongs here." Laughter erupted around them, sharp and echoing, a tidal wave of jeers that crashed against Emma, drowning her, suffocating her, pulling her under. Emma's hands shook, her jaw clenched, her nails biting into her palms as the crowd closed in, their eyes glittering, their smiles widening, their voices rising like a storm that threatened to swallow her whole. And as the room spun, as the walls closed in, as the laughter grew louder and louder, Emma's heart sank. The bitter taste of shame coating her tongue, the realization settling over her like a dark, suffocating shroud. They didn't just see her as nothing. They saw her as less than nothing, and they weren't done with her yet. The laughter reverberated through the ballroom like a haunting echo, the sound clawing through Emma's chest, slicing through her skin, leaving invisible wounds that bled humiliation. The man in the tailored suit leaned back, his smirk widening as he raised his champagne glass, his eyes glittering with cruel delight. "Hey everyone!" He called out, his voice booming across the room, drawing every gaze to Emma like a spotlight burning through her skin. "Looks like the entertainment has arrived. Come on, sweetheart, give us a show." Emma's cheeks flamed, her hands trembling as she pressed herself harder against the marble wall, her heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped bird desperate to escape. The guests turned their eyes sharp and, cutting their lips, twisted into vicious grins as they zeroed in on her. Oh, is she one of those poverty-to-palace sob stories? A woman in a silver gown sneered, her diamond earrings swinging as she tipped her head back, her laugh high and cruel. Maybe she thought she could blend in another, chimed in, her red nails tapping against her glass, each click a deliberate taunting rhythm. Emma swallowed, her throat dry, her pulse roaring in her ears as the room spun around her, faces blurring together into a sea of jeering eyes and sneering mouths. Or maybe the man in the suit said, his voice dropping to a sinister purr as he stepped closer, his shadow falling over her like a storm cloud. She thought she could con her way into a rich man's bed. Gasps echoed through the crowd, hands flying to mouths, eyes widening as more heads swiveled in Emma's direction. The room was spinning now, the walls closing in, the laughter growing louder, sharper, a crescendo of mockery that pressed down on her, suffocating. Emma's breath came in quick, shallow pants, her vision swimming, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. "Please," she whispered, her voice a thin, broken thread, but it was drowned out by the roar of laughter, the sneers, the whispers that hissed through the air like venom. "Oh, come on, don't look so scared," the man said, his eyes dark, predatory as he leaned in closer, his breath hot against her cheek. "You came to play with the big boys, didn't you?" A woman in a gold dress slithered forward, her manicured hand reaching out to flick at a loose strand of Emma's hair, her red lips curving into a wicked smile. "Or did you think you could charm your way into our world with that sad little dress?" She cooed, her voice dripping with condescension. "Honey, this isn't a charity ball." Laughter erupted again, louder this time, a rolling wave of cruelty that crashed over Emma, drowning her, pulling her under. Emma's fists clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms, the sting grounding her, keeping her from falling apart as the crowd pressed in closer. A ring of eyes and teeth and laughter that closed around her like a vice. The man in the suit reached for her, his hand wrapping around her wrist, his grip bruising, unyielding. "Where do you think you're going, sweetheart?" he said, his voice a low, menacing growl that sent chills racing down her spine. "We're not done with you yet." Emma's heart hammered, her pulse a wild, frantic drumbeat as she tried to pull away, but his grip tightened, his fingers digging into her skin like claws. "Let me go!" she choked out, her voice cracking, but the man only grinned, his teeth flashing as he leaned in, his eyes gleaming with wicked glee. "Not until you tell us what a girl like you is doing here," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Did you sneak in to steal a purse, or are you just here to remind us what failure looks like?" The crowd erupted into fresh laughter, glasses, clinking, hands clapping, as if this were some twisted performance and Emma was the main attraction. Tears pricked her eyes, her throat tightening, her chest heaving as she yanked her wrist, desperate to break free. But the man held firm, his grin widening, his nails biting into her skin. "You thought you could play with the rich and powerful," he sneered, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, his face inches from hers. "You thought you could walk among us and not get crushed." Emma's knees wobbled, her vision blurring, the world spinning around her as the crowd pressed in, their faces leering, their voices rising, the air thick with the scent of champagne and expensive perfume and the stench of their viciousness. The woman in the gold dress raised her glass, her red lips curving into a smug smile as she tilted her head back and shouted, "To the little nobody who thought she could be one of us." The crowd roared, glasses lifted high, champagne spilling over the rims as they laughed, their voices echoing, growing louder, sharper, more relentless. Emma's heart pounded her chest, tightening her breath, catching as she wrenched her wrist free, stumbling back. Her back hitting the wall, the cold marble biting through her dress. The room tilted, the walls closing in, the faces blurring together into a kaleidoscope of sneering mouths and glittering eyes and cruel mocking laughter that surrounded her, swallowed her, buried her alive. And as the man stepped forward, his grin widening, his hand reaching for her once more, Emma's breath hitched her chest, heaving, her vision darkening as the world closed in and the floor fell away beneath her. The world spun in a dizzying blur of glittering gowns and flashing cameras, the laughter growing louder, sharper, a razor slicing through Emma's skin. The man in the suit grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like talons, his eyes dark predatory, his smile a wicked slash across his face. "You think you can just walk away?" He snarled, his breath hot against her ear. "Not until you tell us who you really are, sweetheart." The crowd pressed closer, forming a suffocating circle around them, their eyes gleaming with cruel amusement, their phones raised high to capture every second of her humiliation. Emma's chest tightened, her pulse roaring like a tidal wave, as she tried to pull away, but the man's grip only tightened, his nails biting into her skin. "Let me go," she gasped, her voice breaking, but he just laughed, the sound low, cold, dripping with venom. "Why? So you can sneak back to whatever sewer you crawled out of." A woman in a sparkling silver gown stepped forward, her red lips curving into a wicked smirk as she sauntered up to Emma, her heels clicking against the polished floor like the ticking of a clock, counting down to the moment Emma would shatter. "Oh, come on," she purred, reaching out to brush a strand of Emma's hair behind her ear, her nails grazing her skin like a threat. "Don't you want to tell us your sob story? Did you sneak on board to beg for scraps? Or were you hoping to find a rich husband to drag you out of the gutter?" Laughter erupted around them, the sound bouncing off the walls, echoing in Emma's skull like a relentless, merciless drumbeat. Emma's knees trembled, her vision blurring, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the room tilted, the walls closing in. The man yanked her forward, forcing her to stumble into the center of the dance floor, the chandelier overhead casting a spotlight that burned through her skin, illuminating her like a caged animal on display. "Look at her," he sneered, shoving her forward, his voice booming across the room. "She thinks she's one of us. She thinks she belongs here." The guests leaned in, their eyes glittering, their smiles wide, cruel, hungry. "You don't belong here," the man said, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper that sliced through the air like a blade. "You're nothing." A waiter passed by, a silver tray balanced on his palm, glasses of champagne sparkling beneath the chandelier's glow. The man snatched a glass, his eyes never leaving Emma's, his grin widening as he tipped the glass forward, the golden liquid spilling over her head, soaking her hair, her dress dripping down her face like acid. The crowd gasped, then burst into raucous laughter, phones flashing as they captured every second, every tear, every tremble. Emma's hands shook, her fists clenched at her sides, her hair plastered to her skin. Champagne burning her eyes, her lips, the bitter scent clinging to her like a stain she couldn't wash away. "Oh, did the little nobody get wet?" The woman in silver cooed, her voice syrupy, sweet, her eyes glittering with malice as she stepped closer, her fingers tracing a line down Emma's cheek, smearing the tears and champagne across her skin. "Poor thing," she sneered, her lips curving into a wicked smile. "Maybe we should throw her overboard. You know, to wash off the stench of desperation." Laughter exploded around them, a deafening roar that swallowed Emma whole, the sound pressing against her chest, her throat squeezing until she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. Emma's vision blurred, the room spinning, the faces morphing into grotesque masks of sneering mouths and flashing teeth, the lights above glaring down like a cruel, merciless sun. The man grabbed her arm again, yanking her closer, his breath hot against her ear, his grip bruising. "Who let you in here, huh?" He hissed, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that sent chills racing down her spine. "Did you think you could pretend to be one of us? Did you think we wouldn't see right through you?" Emma's breath hitched, her heart slamming against her ribs, her skin burning beneath his touch, beneath the champagne that clung to her like poison. "I didn't what?" The man snarled, his nails digging into her arm, his eyes gleaming with vicious delight. "Didn't expect to get caught? Didn't think we'd notice the little nobody trying to blend in, The woman in silver leaned in, her eyes dark, her lips curving into a slow, predatory smile. "You're a joke," she said, her voice dripping with venom, each word a dagger that sliced through Emma's skin. A pathetic, dirty, worthless joke. The crowd howled with laughter, the sound crashing over Emma in waves, suffocating her, drowning, her pulling her under. Emma's knees buckled, her breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps, as the room spun, the lights blurring, the walls closing in. The voices rising, crashing, echoing in her skull like the relentless pounding of a drum. And as the man's grip tightened, as the woman's smile widened, as the crowd closed in around her, Emma's heart sank, her vision darkening, the world falling away beneath her feet. Because they weren't just trying to humiliate her. They were trying to crush her, to break her, to make her disappear. And tonight, in the center of the glittering ballroom, beneath the blinding lights and the relentless laughter, they just might succeed. The laughter echoed in Emma's ears, a relentless roar that pulsed through her skull, drowning out her thoughts, her breath, her heartbeat. The man's grip tightened around her arm, his nails digging in his smirk, widening as he leaned closer, his breath hot against her cheek. "You didn't answer me," he sneered, his voice low, dripping with mockery. "Who let you on this ship, little stray? Or did you sneak in to steal from us?" The crowd closed in, their faces blurring together, their eyes sharp, predatory, waiting for her to break. Emma's knees shook, her pulse a wild, frantic drumbeat as she tried to pull away, but the man's grip only tightened, his jaw clenched, his eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "Let me go," she whispered, her voice trembling, but he only laughed, the sound low and dark, a blade slicing through the air. "Oh, she thinks she can order us around," the woman in silver purred, her red lips curving into a wicked smile as she stepped forward, her nails trailing down Emma's arm, leaving a trail of burning red welts. "Sweetheart, you're nothing here. Just another little rat trying to nibble at our scraps." The crowd roared with laughter, champagne glasses clinking, phones raised high to record every second of her shame, every quiver, every tear. Emma's vision blurred, her throat tight, the scent of champagne thick in the air, clinging to her skin, soaking through her dress, seeping into her bones. "Look at her," the man said, shoving her forward, her knees slamming into the marble floor, her palms scraping against the cold, hard surface. "She's pathetic." Cameras flashed, capturing her on her knees, her hair dripping with champagne, her eyes wide and glassy, her lips quivering as the room spun around her, as the walls closed in, as their laughter rose sharp and cruel, a chorus of sneers and taunts that echoed through the ballroom like a death knell. "Maybe we should throw her overboard." The woman in silver sneered, her eyes flashing with malicious glee as she leaned down, her face inches from Emma's, her breath hot and sweet with the scent of expensive wine. "Wouldn't that be a fitting end for a little nobody like you?" The man laughed, a deep, cruel sound that sent shivers down Emma's spine, his fingers wrapping around her hair, yanking her head back, forcing her to look up to meet his eyes, dark and gleaming, full of venom. "Who do you think you are, huh?" he snarled, his grip tightening, his jaw clenched. "You think you can sneak onto our ship, crash our party, and walk away without paying the price?" Emma's eyes burned, her chest heaving, her breaths coming in quick, shallow pants as she fought to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over, that threatened to break her. "Please," she whispered, her voice small, fragile, a tiny broken thing swallowed by their laughter, their sneers, their flashing cameras. "Please, I didn't do anything wrong." The woman in silver threw her head back and laughed, the sound high and shrill, echoing through the ballroom like a siren's wail. "Oh, honey," she said, her eyes glinting as she reached out, her nails grazing Emma's cheek, her touch cold, cruel. "Existing in our world is the only crime you committed. And now you're gonna pay for it." Before Emma could respond, a deep booming voice cut through the laughter, slicing through the air like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room. "Let her go. Now." The crowd fell silent, the laughter dying instantly, the air thick, suffocating as every head turned toward the grand staircase. There at the top of the stairs stood a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark, fierce eyes that blazed beneath the glittering chandeliers. His jaw set, his fists clenched, his expression thunderous. Ethan Carter, the owner of the cruise ship, the man who ruled this floating palace, and the brother she hadn't seen in years. The man holding Emma's hair released her as if he'd been burned, stumbling back, his face draining of color, his eyes wide, frantic, his chest heaving as Ethan's gaze pinned him to the floor. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Ethan said, his voice low, dangerous, vibrating through the room like a drum beat. Each word, a blow that struck them all, sent them reeling, trembling. The woman in silver straightened her red lips, parting her hands, shaking as she took a step back, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. But there was none. Ethan's gaze fell to Emma, his eyes softening, his jaw clenching as he took her in. Her hair dripping with champagne, her cheeks flushed, her hands scraped and bleeding, her eyes wet wide, filled with shame. Ethan's jaw ticked, his fists tightening his chest, rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths as he stepped forward, his gaze dark, furious, locked onto the man who had dragged Emma across the floor like she was nothing. "Do you have any idea who she is?" Ethan said, his voice a low, lethal growl that sent a shiver racing down every spine, every head, bowing every breath held. The man in the suit swallowed his throat, bobbing sweat pooling at his temples as he shook his head, his hands trembling. "I didn't." Ethan's jaw clenched, his eyes blazing as he closed the distance between them, his fists clenched, his shoulders squared. "You didn't?" What he said, his voice deadly calm, his eyes dark and dangerous. "You didn't think to ask before you humiliated my sister." Gasps echoed through the room, eyes widening, jaws dropping as the realization sank in, as the truth hit them like a tidal wave crashing over them, pulling them under. Emma Carter, the woman they had called a nobody. The woman they had shoved, taunted, and drenched in champagne. The sister of the most powerful man on the ship. The man stumbled back, his eyes wild, his chest heaving, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as Ethan advanced, his eyes cold. His fists clenched, his jaw, set his voice dropping to a dangerous spine, chilling murmur. "You humiliated my sister?" he said, his eyes never leaving the man's face, his gaze hard, unrelenting. "You treated her like dirt, and now you're going to pay." The crowd trembled, the air thick with fear, with shame, with the suffocating realization that they hadn't just humiliated some poor girl in a cheap dress. They had humiliated the sister of the man who owned the very ground they were standing on. And now, as Ethan's eyes blazed with fury, as Emma stood tall beside him, her shoulders squared, her chin, lifted, her tears drying, the tables had turned. And every single one of them knew it. The silence crashed over the ballroom like a thunderclap, the air thick, suffocating, heavy with dread. The guests stood frozen, their eyes wide, their faces pale, as Ethan Carter's gaze swept over them like a predator stalking prey. His jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides, the veins in his neck pulsing beneath his skin as he took a slow, deliberate step forward. The man in the suit swallowed his Adam's apple, bobbing sweat dripping down his temple as he stumbled back, his knees wobbling, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. "You thought she was a nobody," Ethan said, his voice a low, lethal growl that echoed through the room, each word a bullet fired straight into their chests. "You thought you could drag her, humiliate her, strip her of her dignity because she didn't look like you. Because she wasn't draped in diamonds or drenching herself in perfume worth more than most people's salaries." His eyes blazed, his nostrils flaring as he looked down at the man who still reeked of champagne and arrogance, his jaw quivering, his hands trembling as Ethan towered over him like a storm cloud about to break. "But you didn't know who she was, did you?" The man shook his head, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps, his eyes wide and glassy. The reality sinking in the enormity of what he'd done, crashing over him like a tidal wave. "I didn't know." He choked, his voice shaking, cracking, splintering beneath the weight of Ethan's fury. "I swear I didn't know." "Didn't know?" Ethan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, his face inches from the man's, his breath hot, his eyes dark, burning. "You didn't need to know. You just needed to be a decent human being." The man whimpered, his knees buckling as Ethan's stare bore into him, unrelenting, unyielding, a force of nature that refused to be silenced. The woman in silver stood frozen, her red lips parted, her fingers clutching the stem of her champagne glass so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice trembling, her eyes wide, glistening with unshed tears. "Please, we didn't know she was your sister. You didn't care." Ethan snarled, his eyes snapping to her, his jaw tightening as he advanced, each step a death knell, each word a hammer driving nails into their coffins. "You didn't care who she was. You just cared that she wasn't one of you." The woman's lower lip trembled, her mascara smearing as tears spilled over her shoulders, shaking her breath, coming in shallow, desperate gasps. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking her head, bowing as her chest heaved. "I didn't mean—" "You meant every word," Ethan said, his voice hard cold, final. "You threw champagne on her. You shoved her. You called her worthless. You called her a nobody." He turned to the crowd, his eyes sweeping over them, each gaze shrinking each head, lowering as the room seemed to close in the walls, pressing tighter, the air growing thicker, heavier, colder. "You all did," Ethan said, his voice echoing through the ballroom, bouncing off the marble walls, crashing down on them like a wave of ice water. "You all laughed, you all watched, you all stood by while they tore her apart." Phones were still raised, screens still recording, but now the footage was of their own shame, their own cruelty, their own vicious, gleeful faces sneering, mocking, humiliating a woman they thought was beneath them. Ethan's jaw clenched, his eyes dark, blazing with fury, as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen behind him lit up, and the video began to play. The room went still, the only sound the hum of the speakers as the footage flickered to life, each frame a damning blow, each word a nail in their coffins. The woman in silver leaning in close, her red lips curling as she sneered, "Maybe we should throw her overboard." Laughter sharp, shrill, echoing like the cackling of a pack of hyenas. The man in the suit gripping Emma's arm, yanking her forward, his face twisted in a sneer as he said, "You think you can walk among us and not get crushed?" The woman tossing champagne over Emma's head, the golden liquid splashing over her hair, her face as the crowd erupted into cruel, vicious laughter. Cameras flashing phones, recording their faces twisted in masks of delight as Emma stood there, dripping, shaking, breaking. The video ended. The screen went dark. The silence was a living, breathing thing, heavy and thick, pressing down on them all, crushing, suffocating. Ethan's fists shook, his knuckles white, his chest rising and falling, with deep, controlled breaths as he stepped forward, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, over the man who still sat slumped against the bar, over the woman in silver who was now sobbing, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking. "You wanted to see a show," Ethan said, his voice low, calm, deadly. "Well, here it is. You're all the stars of your own horror story, and now the world will know exactly who you are." He snapped his fingers, and security guards stepped forward, their eyes cold, their jaws set as they grabbed the man in the suit by the arms, hauling him to his feet. "You're banned from every Carter-owned property," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade, each word a final, merciless blow. "You will never set foot on my ships again. You will never walk in my circles again. You will never be anything but the man who tried to break my sister and ended up breaking himself." The man sobbed, his knees giving out as the guards dragged him away, his cries echoing through the room, bouncing off the walls like a haunting refrain. "Please, Mr. Carter. I didn't know. I didn't know." Ethan turned to the woman in silver, her mascara streaking down her cheeks, her red lips trembling, her eyes wide and wet as she looked up at him, her mouth opening, closing. No words coming out. "You," Ethan said, his voice hard, unforgiving. "You're finished. You're blacklisted from every elite event, every club, every gathering. You will never recover from this." The woman collapsed, her knees hitting the floor with a dull, echoing thud, her sobs tearing through the silence, her hands clutching her hair as she shook as the crowd watched as the world bore witness to her downfall. Ethan turned to the rest of them, his eyes blazing, his fists still shaking. "You all wanted to make her feel like nothing," he said, his voice rising, his eyes sweeping over each and every one of them. "Well, now you're the ones who are nothing." And as Emma stood beside him, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, her tears, drying her heart, pounding, the guests trembled, their eyes wide, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps as they realized the truth. They hadn't just humiliated a poor girl in a cheap dress. They had humiliated the sister of the most powerful man on the ship, and now every single one of them was about to pay. The air was electric, a live wire humming with the charge of fear and fury as Ethan's eyes swept over the crowd, his jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. The guests shrank back, their once sneering faces now pale, their eyes wide, darting around like cornered animals. The man in the suit was dragged away, his pleas echoing down the corridor, each desperate cry growing fainter, swallowed by the walls by the weight of his own actions. The woman in silver crumpled to the floor, her red dress pooling around her like blood, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed, her hands clawing at the floor, as if she could somehow dig herself out of the grave she'd dug. But Ethan wasn't done. He turned to the rest of them, his eyes dark, blazing the fury rolling off him in waves. "You thought you could humiliate my sister and walk away," he said, his voice a low, deadly growl that vibrated through the room, each word a hammer strike. "You thought you could treat her like dirt and suffer no consequences." The guests flinched, their breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps, some clutching at their throats as if the very air had turned to poison. Ethan snapped his fingers, and two more security guards stepped forward, their faces cold blank, their shoulders broad, imposing. "You!" Ethan said, his gaze zeroing in on a man in a white tuxedo, his skin slick with sweat, his face ashen. "You filmed her. You recorded every second of her humiliation and laughed while she begged you to stop." The man shook his head, his eyes wild, his hands trembling as he held them up in surrender. "I didn't mean to. Didn't mean to." What Ethan snapped, his voice a whip, crack his eyes blazing with fury. "Didn't mean to profit off her pain, didn't mean to turn her suffering into your entertainment." The man opened his mouth, but the words died on his tongue as the guards grabbed his arms, hauling him backward, his feet dragging across the marble floor as he struggled, his breaths coming in frantic, panicked gasps. "No, please, I didn't know she was your sister." The guards yanked him through the doorway, his screams echoing through the corridor, the sound twisting, warping, fading into silence. Ethan's chest rose and fell with deep, controlled breaths, his jaw tight, his fists clenched so hard his knuckles were white. The woman in silver hiccuped a sob, her eyes bloodshot. Her makeup smeared, her nails scraping against the floor as she tried to crawl away, her dress tangled around her legs. Ethan stepped forward, his shadow falling over her, his expression hard, unrelenting. "You thought you were a queen," he said, his voice cold, merciless. "You thought you could humiliate her and walk away with your crown still intact." The woman whimpered her head, shaking her eyes, pleading as she reached for his shoes, her nails scratching against the polished leather. "Please," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean—" "You meant every word," Ethan said, his gaze like ice, his fists still clenched. "And now you're the one on your knees." The crowd watched, their faces drawn, their eyes wide, their breaths held as the woman crumbled, her sobs tearing through the silence, her shoulders shaking, her fingers clawing at the floor as if trying to pull herself back up. But there was no coming back. Not tonight. Not ever. Ethan turned to the rest of the guests, his gaze sweeping over them, each face more terrified than the last, each pair of eyes fixed on him, as if he were the executioner and they the condemned. "You all stood by and watched," Ethan said, his voice rising, booming, echoing off the walls, a dark rolling thunder that sent chills racing down every spine. "You all laughed. You all pointed. You all threw your heads back and roared while they poured champagne over her, while they shoved her, while they called her worthless." The guests flinched, some lowering their heads, some covering their mouths, some sobbing into their hands as Ethan's words struck them like bullets, each one a blow, each one a death sentence. "You thought she was beneath you," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, his eyes dark gleaming. "You thought she was nothing, but she is Emma Carter. She is my sister, and that makes her more powerful than any of you will ever be." A man in the back dropped his glass, the crystal shattering against the floor, the sound sharp, piercing, echoing through the silence as the guests trembled as the weight of their actions crushed down on them like a collapsing building. Ethan stepped forward, his boots crunching over the shards, his gaze dark, unrelenting, his jaw tight. From this moment on, he said, his voice a low, deadly murmur, each word a nail hammered into their coffins, "You are all blacklisted. Your names will be removed from every guest list, every VIP lounge, and every event hosted by the Carter family. You will never set foot on this ship again. You will never walk in these circles again." The guests whimpered their heads, lowering their shoulders, shaking their breaths, coming in shallow, ragged gasps, as the realization sank in, as the walls closed in, as the world they thought they owned crumbled beneath their feet. Emma watched her chest heaving, her heart pounding, her fists clenched at her sides as Ethan's words washed over her, as the sight of them crumbling, breaking, sinking to their knees, filled her with a fierce, burning sense of justice. "You tried to make her feel like nothing," Ethan said, his gaze sweeping over them one last time, his eyes dark, fierce, blazing with unyielding fury. "But now, you're the ones who are nothing." The room was silent. The air was heavy, thick, pressing down on them like a shroud. The woman in silver sobbed, her mascara streaking down her cheeks, her nails clawing at the floor as she whispered, "Please, please forgive me." But Ethan turned away, his arm sliding around Emma's shoulders, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the exit as he led her away. His grip firm, protective, unbreakable. And as they walked through the shattered glass, through the wreckage of the elite who had tried to bury her, the guests remained on their knees, their faces buried in their hands, their sobs echoing through the empty ballroom, because tonight they had tried to crush Emma Carter. But instead, they had been the ones destroyed. And now they were left with nothing but the wreckage of their own cruelty, the haunting echoes of their own laughter, and the inescapable reality that they would never be anything but the monsters they had always been. The yacht drifted through the night like a ghost ship, the air thick with the scent of spilled champagne and the bitter tang of tears. The guests remained huddled on the marble floor, their once perfect gowns stained, their once proud chins tucked against their chests, their hands shaking as they clutched their phones like lifelines. Some sobbed openly, their faces buried in their hands, while others sat in stunned silence, their eyes hollow, their breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Ethan Carter stood at the edge of the ballroom, his shoulders squared, his eyes blazing as he surveyed the wreckage of people who once thought they were untouchable. His jaw clenched, his fists tight, his chest heaving as he fought to keep his rage in check, to keep his fury from consuming him entirely. But beside him, Emma stood tall, her head high, her eyes fierce, her spine straight as a blade. Gone was the girl who had been dragged across the floor, drenched in champagne, humiliated before a sea of sneering faces. Now she was a queen, a storm in a sundress, her eyes burning with the fire of every insult, every sneer, every cruel word that had been hurled at her. A woman in a gold dress crawled toward Emma, her makeup streaked down her cheeks, her eyes wide, and wet, her lips trembling as she reached for Emma's hand, her nails chipping as she clawed at the floor. "Please!" she gasped, her voice breaking, her chest heaving as fresh tears spilled down her face. "Please, Emma, I didn't mean it. I didn't know who you were." Emma looked down at her, her jaw tight, her fists clenched, her eyes cold and unyielding. "You didn't need to know who I was," she said, her voice strong and steady. With every word, a stone dropped into the silence, sending ripples of dread through the room. "You only needed to know that I was a person, but you didn't see that. You saw someone you thought was beneath you, someone you thought you could crush without consequence." The woman sobbed harder, her nails scraping against the floor as she crawled closer, her hands reaching for Emma's ankles, her breaths coming in frantic, desperate gasps. "Please!" she begged, her shoulders shaking, her hair falling around her face like a shroud. "I was just playing along. I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to." What Emma snapped, her voice rising, her eyes flashing with fury, her fists shaking at her sides. "Didn't mean to throw champagne in my face. Didn't mean to call me worthless. Didn't mean to laugh while I was dragged across the floor like trash." The woman's sobs grew louder, her shoulders heaving, her face crumpling as she buried it against Emma's feet, her tears soaking the hem of Emma's dress. "I'm so sorry," she choked out, her fingers clutching at the fabric, her voice breaking. "I didn't know you were Ethan Carter's sister." Emma's eyes narrowed, her lips twisting into a bitter, humorless smile as she yanked her dress free. Stepping back, her jaw clenched, her heart pounding. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" she said, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "You only care because now you know who I am, because now you're the one on the floor begging for mercy." The woman crumpled further, her face pressed against the marble, her sobs echoing through the ballroom, mingling with the soft, haunting strains of the distant violin that still played somewhere on the upper deck, a haunting, eerie melody that seemed to mock them all. Ethan stepped forward, his hand warm against Emma's back, his presence a solid grounding force as she straightened her eyes, sweeping over the crowd, over the people who had tried to tear her apart. "You tried to bury me," she said, her voice rising, her chin, lifting, her eyes blazing with the fire of every word they had used to cut her, every sneer, every snicker, every laugh. You tried to crush me under your heels, to strip me of my dignity, to make me feel small, worthless, invisible. The guests flinched, some lowering their heads, some weeping into their hands, some shaking so hard their teeth chattered, their shoulders hunched, their faces twisted in shame. But the truth is, Emma said, her voice rising, her eyes burning, I was never the one who was nothing. I was never the one who was small. I was never the one who was worthless. That was you. You who thought your money made you powerful. You who thought your designer dresses and glittering jewels made you untouchable. You who laughed while I was dragged across the floor, drenched in champagne, shaking in terror. A man in a white suit buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as he rocked back and forth, his phone still clutched in his grip, the screen still playing the video of him laughing, sneering, as Emma begged for mercy. I'm so sorry, he whispered, his voice choked, broken. I didn't know. I didn't know. Emma's chest heaved, her fists clenched, her breaths coming in deep, ragged gasps as she took one final steadying breath, her eyes sweeping over the crowd one last time. You all wanted to see me on the floor, groveling, sobbing, broken, she said, her voice cold, unrelenting, her jaw tight. But look at you now. You're the ones on your knees. You're the ones begging for mercy. You're the ones drowning in your own cruelty. The woman in gold sobbed harder, her nails scraping against the floor as she rocked back and forth, her breath coming in heaving gasps, her eyes wild, desperate, terrified. Ethan stepped forward, his arms sliding around Emma's shoulders, his gaze dark, fierce, protective as he glared down at the guests. His jaw clenched, his voice, a low, deadly murmur that echoed through the room like a final, resounding death knell. You thought you could crush her? He said, his eyes blazing, his fists tightening at his sides. But instead, you crushed yourselves. And as Ethan led Emma away, as they walked through the broken glass and the spilled champagne, the sobs of the fallen echoed behind them, haunting endless, a symphony of their own destruction. Because tonight they had tried to destroy her. Tonight they had tried to bury her in shame. Tonight they had tried to strip her of her dignity and her worth. But tonight they were the ones lying broken on the floor. And as Emma walked away, her head high, her shoulders squared, her hand clutching Ethan's, she knew they would never forget it. The moon hung low over the ocean, its silver glow casting a haunting light across the deck as the yacht cut through the dark waters like a ghost ship. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of spilled champagne and the bitter tang of regret, the sound of sobs and broken whispers lingering like a haunting refrain. Emma stood at the edge of the deck, her hands gripping the cold railing, her knuckles white, her breaths coming in deep, steadying gasps as the wind whipped through her hair, tearing through the remnants of her ruined dress. Behind her, the guests remained slumped on the marble floor, their once proud faces streaked with tears, their shoulders shaking as they rocked back and forth, the weight of their own cruelty pressing down on them like a tombstone. Ethan stepped up beside her, his presence a solid wall of warmth and strength, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark and fierce as he looked out over the endless expanse of black water. His hand slid over hers, his fingers threading through hers, his touch grounding her, anchoring her to the moment, to reality, to herself. You okay? He murmured, his voice low, his breath warm against her ear, a gentle contrast to the chill that clung to the night. Emma swallowed hard, her throat tight, her chest heaving as she struggled to find her voice, to find herself amid the chaos that still echoed through her mind. Their laughter, their sneers, their cruel cutting words that clung to her skin like poison. I was nothing to them, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the dark horizon, the wind tearing at her hair, the waves crashing against the hull like the beating of 1,000 broken hearts. They looked at me and saw nothing but a girl in a cheap dress. They looked at me and thought they could crush me. Ethan's jaw tightened, his grip on her hand, tightening his chest, heaving with deep, controlled breaths as his eyes flashed, his fists clenching at his sides. They didn't crush you? He said, his voice a low, fierce growl that vibrated through her bones, a pulse, a heartbeat, a promise. You stood tall, you fought back, you didn't let them win. Emma's eyes burned, her vision blurring, as she blinked back, the tears that threatened to spill over her jaw tight, her chest aching as the memories surged forward, a tidal wave of humiliation and pain and shame. "I almost did," she said, her voice breaking, her nails biting into the cold metal railing, as her shoulders shook, as her knees wobbled, as the world tilted beneath her feet. "I almost let them break me." Ethan stepped closer, his arms wrapping around her, his chest pressing against her back, his breath warm against her neck, as he held her, as he anchored her, as he whispered, "But they didn't. You're still here. You're still standing. And they're the ones on their knees." Emma's breath hitched, her eyes closing, her head falling back against his chest as she let out a shuddering sob. The weight of everything she'd been holding inside, crashing over her like a wave, dragging her under, threatening to drown her. But Ethan held her tighter, his arms like iron bands around her, his breath a steady rhythm against her skin, a lifeline, a buoy, a promise that she wasn't alone. "I thought I was nothing," she whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes still closed as the tears slipped free, warm and wet against her cheeks. "I thought they were right. I thought I was nothing." Ethan's hands cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears, his eyes fierce blazing as he turned her to face him, his jaw tight, his gaze intense. "You are not nothing," he said, his voice low, his breath warm, his eyes locked onto hers, each word a hammer driving the truth into her heart. "You are Emma Carter. You are my sister. You are strong. You are brave. You are powerful. And they will never forget it." Emma's chest heaved, her breaths coming in quick, shallow bursts as she stared up at him, as his words wrapped around her like a shield, like armor, like a second skin. "But what if they don't learn?" she whispered, her voice breaking, her hands clutching at his shirt, her nails digging into the fabric as her shoulders shook, as her knees threatened to give out. What if they just go back to being the same monsters they were before? Ethan's eyes darkened, his jaw clenched, his hands tightening around her face as he leaned in, his forehead pressing against hers, his breath hot and steady against her lips. "Then we make sure they never forget," he said, his voice a low, deadly promise that sent a shiver racing down her spine. "We remind them every day of what they did. We remind them every time they see you standing tall, unbroken, untouchable." Emma swallowed, her eyes closing, her chest heaving as she breathed him in, as she let his words sink in, as she let his strength flow through her, filling the cracks, sealing the wounds, piecing her back together. "I'm still here," she whispered, her voice stronger, her chin lifting, her eyes opening, fierce and bright and burning, with a fire that refused to be extinguished. "They tried to crush me, but I'm still here." Ethan's eyes softened, his hands sliding down to her shoulders, his fingers squeezing gently, reassuringly. "And you're stronger than ever," he said, his voice a warm, steady murmur that wrapped around her like a blanket, soothing, comforting, unbreakable. "You faced the worst of them, and you didn't break. You're still standing, and that's more than they'll ever be able to say." Emma took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs, clearing her mind, washing away the last traces of their laughter, their sneers, their cruelty. She stepped back, her spine straight, her shoulders squared, her eyes fixed on the horizon, the waves crashing against the hull like a symphony of her own heartbeat, relentless, powerful, unstoppable. "They thought they could bury me," she said, her voice strong, her chin high, her eyes burning with resolve. "But they didn't know I was a seed, and now I'm growing, and they can't stop me." Ethan's lips curved into a slow, proud smile, his eyes shining as he watched her, as he saw the fire in her eyes, the steel in her spine, the strength in her stance. "No, Emma," he said, his voice a soft, reverent murmur that carried through the wind, through the night, through the endless expanse of ocean and sky. "They can't. They never could." And as the yacht sailed into the night, as the lights of the shore faded into the distance, as the waves rocked them forward, Emma stood tall at the edge of the deck, her heart pounding, her breath steady, her soul alight with the fire of a girl who refused to be broken. Because tonight she had faced the monsters and walked away unscathed. Tonight she had risen from the ashes of their cruelty stronger, fiercer, unbreakable. And tonight she was more powerful than they ever imagined. The ship docked in the harbor like a fallen kingdom, its gleaming lights casting fractured reflections across the black water. The guests shuffled down the gangway, their heads bowed, their shoulders hunched, their faces ghostly pale beneath the cruel glare of flashing cameras. Reporters swarmed the pier microphones, thrust forward questions slicing through the air like daggers. "Is it true you attacked the sister of Ethan Carter? What do you have to say to the woman you humiliated? How does it feel to be blacklisted by the Carter family? The woman in the gold dress stumbled her heels, catching on the wooden planks. Her makeup smeared her red lips, trembling as she tried to shield her face with her manicured hands. The cameras caught everything. The streaks of mascara trailing down her cheeks, the tears glistening beneath the harsh, unforgiving lights, the terror in her eyes as she tried to push past the reporters, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Please!" She choked her voice, breaking her shoulders, shaking as the crowd pressed closer, as the questions grew louder, more vicious, more relentless. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know. A man in a white tuxedo shoved through the crowd, his face flushed, his jaw clenched, his eyes wild as he shouted at the cameras, his hands shaking. "This is all a misunderstanding," he snarled, his voice cracking, desperation leaking through every syllable. "She was a nobody. We didn't know. A nobody," a reporter snapped, shoving a microphone into his face. Her eyes narrowed, her lips twisted in a sneer. "She's the sister of Ethan Carter, and now you're the nobody." Flash, click. Flash, click. Each camera flash was a gunshot. Each click, a bullet. Each captured image, another nail driven into the coffin of their once perfect reputations. The woman sobbed, her hands clawing at her face, her breaths coming in heaving gasps, as the world watched her fall apart, as the ground crumbled beneath her feet, as the kingdom she thought she ruled turned to ash around her. "I didn't mean it," she whispered, her knees buckling, her body sinking to the dock as the cameras crowded around her, as her name echoed through the air like a curse. "I didn't mean it." Inside the yacht, Emma stood at the window, her hands pressed against the cool glass, her eyes fixed on the chaos unfolding below her chest, rising and falling in the deep, steady breaths. The wind howled outside, whipping through her hair, chilling her skin, carrying with it the echoes of their screams, their sobs, their pleas for mercy. But mercy was not a currency she was willing to spend tonight. Ethan stepped up behind her, his presence a solid grounding force. His jaw set, his eyes dark and fierce as he looked out over the dock, his arms crossing over his chest, his fists clenched. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly murmur that vibrated through her bones, that wrapped around her like a protective shield. Emma swallowed her gaze, never leaving the woman on the dock, her fingers curling against the glass, her nails biting into her palms as she watched the woman rock back and forth. Her sobs echoing through the night, a haunting, pitiful wail that clawed through the air like a siren's song. "They wanted to make me feel like nothing," Emma said, her voice tight, her jaw clenched, her breath fogging up the glass. "They wanted to strip me of my dignity, to bury me in shame, to break me until there was nothing left." Ethan's jaw ticked, his fists tightening, his eyes blazing with a fire that threatened to burn the whole world down. But they didn't. He said, his voice a dark, dangerous promise, each word a hammer striking an anvil. "You're still here. You're still standing. And they're the ones on the ground." Emma took a deep breath, her eyes closing, her lashes wet her chest, heaving as she forced herself to breathe, to feel or remember every word they had thrown at her, every sneer, every laugh, every cruel, cutting remark that had sliced through her skin like shards of glass. "They said I was worthless," she whispered, her hands trembling, her spine straightening, her jaw setting. "They said I was a nobody." Ethan's fingers brushed against hers, his touch warm, grounding a tether to reality, to the truth, to the girl she had almost forgotten herself to be. "They were wrong," he said, his voice softening, his eyes dark and tense locked onto hers. "You are everything." Emma's eyes opened, her gaze fierce, burning, unbroken, as she stared out over the dock, over the fallen, broken, sobbing wrecks of people who had once tried to bury her. "They tried to bury me," she said, her voice rising, her chin, lifting, her eyes blazing with the fire of every insult, every sneer, every cruel word they had hurled at her. "But they didn't know I was a seed, and now I'm rising." The wind howled louder, the waves crashing against the hull, the sea churning beneath them, like a beast awakened a storm, unleashed a fury unbound. Below, the woman in the gold dress sobbed harder, her hands clawing at the wooden planks, her shoulders shaking as the cameras flashed, as the reporters shouted, as her own cruelty came back to haunt her, a ghost that would never let her rest. "Please," she sobbed, her voice a broken, wretched whimper that echoed through the night, that drifted up to where Emma stood, unyielding, untouchable. "Please, I didn't know. I didn't know." But Emma only turned away, her hand slipping from the glass, her spine straight, her chin high, her heart pounding as she stepped forward, as she walked away, as she left them to drown in the storm they had created. Because tonight she had been the girl on her knees, sobbing, shaking, broken. Tonight they had tried to strip her of her worth, to bury her in shame, to crush her beneath the weight of their cruelty. But tonight she had risen. And now they were the ones left in the dust, screaming, sobbing, begging for a mercy that would never come. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath the moonlight, a vast dark abyss swallowing the night, the wind howling like a haunting lullaby. Emma stood at the bow of the yacht, the cold wind biting against her skin, her hair whipping around her face as she stared out into the black expanse. The dock and its wreckage of fallen elites lay far behind their screams and sobs, fading into nothing but distant echoes. The air was sharp, crisp, a clean slate, a new beginning. Beside her, Ethan stood tall, his presence solid, unyielding. His jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. His eyes were dark, haunted, reflecting the moon's pale glow, as he looked down at his sister, the girl they had tried to bury. Emma inhaled deeply, the salty air filling her lungs, the cool breeze washing over her, cleansing, her strippings away the remnants of their cruelty, their laughter, their taunts that still echoed through her mind like the ghost of a nightmare. "They wanted to destroy me," she whispered, her voice soft, steady each word, a drop of water falling into the vast, endless ocean. "They wanted to tear me apart, to crush me under their heels and leave me drowning in shame." Ethan's jaw tightened, his fists clenching so hard his knuckles went white, the veins in his neck bulging, his breath coming in slow, controlled exhales. "But you didn't drown," he said, his voice a low, fierce murmur that vibrated through the night, through her bones, through her heart. "You rose." Emma closed her eyes, the wind whipping her hair back, the scent of salt and seaweed thick in the air, the sound of waves crashing against the hull, a steady, relentless rhythm. "I almost let them break me," she said, her voice trembling, her fists clenched at her sides, her nails biting into her palms. "I almost believed them. I almost believed I was nothing." Ethan stepped closer, his hand sliding over hers, his fingers threading through hers, his grip firm, grounding, unbreakable. "You are not nothing," he said, his voice a low, fierce vow, each word a lifeline thrown into the abyss. "You are everything." Emma swallowed hard, her throat tight, her eyes burning as the memory of their sneers, their laughter, their cruel, mocking words echoed through her mind, slicing through her skin like shards of glass. "They said I was worthless," she whispered, her breath catching her chest heaving as the tears slipped free, hot and wet against her cold skin. "They said I was a nobody." Ethan's jaw clenched, his gaze darkening, his grip on her hand tightening as he pulled her closer, his eyes locked onto hers, fierce, burning. "They said that because they feared you." He said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that vibrated through her bones, that sent a shiver racing down her spine. "They feared the power you had to show them what they truly are. Nothing." Emma's breath hitched her heart, pounding her pulse, roaring in her ears, as Ethan's words sank in, as the truth wrapped around her like a warm, protective shroud. "They tried to bury me," she said, her voice stronger now, her spine straightening, her chin, lifting, her eyes blazing with a fire that refused to be extinguished. "But they didn't know I was a seed, and now I'm rising." Ethan's lips curved into a slow, proud smile, his eyes shining with fierce, unyielding pride as he cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears, his breath warm against her skin. "You're more than rising," he said, his voice a soft, reverent murmur. "You're soaring." Emma exhaled, her chest expanding, her lungs filling with the cold, sharp night air, her heart pounding like a drum. A battle cry, a heartbeat that refused to be silenced. She stepped forward, her hand slipping from Ethan's as she walked to the very edge of the deck, her hands gripping the railing, her eyes fixed on the endless dark horizon, the moon casting a silver path across the water like a bridge to the future. "They tried to make me disappear," she said, her voice rising, carrying through the night like a war cry, fierce, unbreakable, echoing across the waves. "But I am here, and they will never forget me." Behind her, the fallen guests remained scattered across the dock, their sobs and wails drifting up to the yacht like the mournful cries of a sinking ship. They had tried to strip her of her dignity, to bury her beneath their cruelty, to drag her down into the abyss of their own emptiness. But instead, they were the ones left drowning in their own disgrace, their own shame, their own monstrous reflections staring back at them from every screen, every mirror, every unforgiving eye that had watched them tear a woman apart and delight in her suffering. Ethan stepped up beside her, his shoulder pressing against hers, his eyes dark and fierce as he looked out over the endless sea. His jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. "They thought their money made them powerful," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed across the water, that vibrated through her bones. But tonight, they learned the truth. Power isn't about money. Power is about how you rise after they try to bury you. Emma's eyes closed, the wind whipping through her hair, the moonlight bathing her in a silver glow, her heart pounding her soul, alight with the fire of a girl who refused to be broken, a woman who refused to be erased. "They will remember me," she said, her voice a soft, fierce vow, her breath fogging up the cold night air. "They will remember what they did to me, and they will remember what I became because of it." Ethan's arm wrapped around her shoulders, pulling her close, his jaw tight, his eyes dark as he looked out over the water, the waves crashing against the hull like the beating of 1,000 war drums, a relentless, unstoppable force. "They thought they could drown you," he said, his voice a low, fierce growl that echoed through the night, that carried across the water like a prophecy. But they forgot one thing. Emma turned to him, her eyes fierce and blazing, her lips curving into a slow, dangerous smile, as she said, "I was the storm." And as the yacht sailed into the darkness, as the wind howled and the waves crashed and the moon hung low like a silent, watchful eye, Emma stood at the bow, her chin high, her spine straight, her heart, a fierce, unyielding drumbeat that echoed through the night, through the water, through the world. Because tonight they had tried to bury her. Tonight they had tried to crush her. Tonight they had tried to make her disappear. But tonight she was more powerful than ever. And now, they were the ones left drowning in the storm they had unleashed.